Imagine sitting home alone, the lights dimmed, and your surroundings eerily quiet, when suddenly you hear a faint sound you can't explain. What would you do? Tonight, I'm sharing 10 true, disturbing home alone horror stories that will make you question every creak, shadow, and whisper in the dark. These are the kinds of stories you'll want to leave the lights on for. Before we dive in, don't forget to hit that like button. If you love spine-chilling horror, subscribe to the channel to stay updated on more terrifying tales, and leave a comment down below about your scariest home alone experience. Who knows, your story might just make it into the next video. You're home alone, scrolling through your phone, when you hear it. A soft knock at the front door. You freeze, heart racing, and glance at the clock. It's 3 a.m. Who could it be at this hour? Ignoring it feels safer, but the knocking grows louder, more insistent. You finally peek through the peephole, but there's no one there. Then you hear it again, but this time, it's coming from inside the house. If you think that's chilling, just wait until you hear the rest of these 10 true disturbing home alone horror stories. When I moved into my new apartment, I thought I had finally found the perfect place. It was quiet, affordable, and close enough to the city for convenience, but far enough away to avoid the chaos. The only downside was the basement. It was old, damp, and gave off an unsettling vibe, but I figured I'd just avoid it unless absolutely necessary. I had no idea how wrong I'd be. It started with faint noises, scratching, faint thuds, and the occasional creak of something heavy moving. I told myself it was just the pipes, or maybe rats. After all, it was an old building, but late one night as I sat in my living room, I heard it clearly. Heavy footsteps coming from the basement. My heart raced, but I convinced myself it was one of my neighbors. Probably someone coming home late and using the shared storage space down there. But then I remembered, my apartment is the only one with access to the basement. The stairs to it are in my unit. I grabbed a flashlight and reluctantly crept to the basement door. It was closed, but the noises didn't stop. I swung the door open, shining the beam of light down the narrow staircase. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. Silence. I waited a few seconds, then cautiously descended the stairs. The air felt colder with each step, and the damp smell of mildew was overwhelming. When I reached the bottom, I shined my flashlight around. Everything seemed normal. Old furniture, cardboard boxes, and some rusty tools left by the previous tenant. Just as I turned to go back upstairs, I heard something, a faint whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then it came again. A single word, barely audible. "Stay." I froze, my blood running cold. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment, I thought I saw a shadow dart behind an old wardrobe. I ran upstairs, slammed the door shut, and locked it. I told myself it was my imagination, but the sounds didn't stop. The footsteps continued, this time moving up the stairs toward the locked door. I sat in my bedroom, gripping my phone, debating whether to call the police. Suddenly, the noises stopped. Silence filled the apartment, so heavy it felt oppressive. I ran upstairs, slammed the door shut and locked it. I told myself it was my imagination, but the sounds didn't stop. The footsteps continued, this time moving up the stairs toward the locked door. I sat in my bedroom, gripping my phone, debating whether to call the police. Suddenly, the noises stopped. Silence filled the apartment, so heavy it felt oppressive. I'm not sure how much longer I can stay in this apartment, but wherever I go, I'll never forget the stranger in the basement. If that story gave you chills, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment about your scariest home alone experience. More stories are coming, so stay tuned. I had just moved into an old apartment building on the edge of town, a place that seemed perfect for a fresh start. It was quiet, with peeling paint and creaky floors, but there was something oddly charming about it. The building had a history that felt like it had been sealed away for decades. The neighbors were few, and the landlord, an elderly woman, was kind but mysterious. She gave me a knowing smile when she handed me the keys, as though she understood something I didn't. One evening, while sitting in my living room, I noticed something out of place across the street. An old house, barely visible from my window, had a strange doll in the window. I didn't think much of it at first. It was probably just another eerie decoration for Halloween, even though the season had passed. The doll's face was twisted into an unnerving grin, and it seemed to be staring directly at me. The more I looked, the more uneasy I felt. Its eyes, they didn't look like a doll's eyes. They were too lifelike, too knowing. Over the next few days, I couldn't help but notice the doll in the window every time I looked out. It stayed there, unmoving, always in the same position. But then something strange happened. One evening, as I glanced out the window, the doll was gone. A chill ran down my spine. I thought maybe I had imagined it, but the unsettling feeling didn't go away. I tried to shake it off, but the nagging thought of the doll stuck with me. The next morning, I went to the mailbox and found a small package with no return address. My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't ordered anything, and yet there it was. Trembling, I opened it to find the same doll, but this time it was different. It had a note attached to it, scribbled hastily, "Keep her safe." Confused and unnerved, I left the doll on my kitchen counter, not sure what to do with it. The rest of the day passed in a haze of unease. I kept glancing over my shoulder, feeling like someone was watching me. That night, I locked the doll in a closet, thinking it would be best to get rid of it in the morning. But the next morning, the doll was back on the kitchen counter, smiling that same unnerving grin. I didn't know what to think anymore. I tried calling the landlord to ask if she knew anything about it, but she didn't answer. I decided to confront the house across the street, hoping to speak to the owner and get some answers. When I arrived, the house was quiet. The yard was overgrown, the windows dark. No one answered the door, so I ventured around to the backyard. That's when I saw something that made my blood run cold. The window of the upstairs room was open, and behind the glass, the doll was sitting, staring right at me. I bolted back to my apartment, but as soon as I entered, I found the doll once again waiting for me, this time positioned on my bed. I could feel its eyes on me, following me wherever I went. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the doll's face, its eyes wide and unblinking. I didn't dare go near it. It was as if it had a life of its own, a presence that I couldn't escape. The next day, I packed my things and left the apartment, leaving the doll behind. But before I could lock the door, I heard a voice whisper from behind me, faint but unmistakable. "You'll never escape." I never went back to that apartment. I don't know what's worse, the fact that I still see that doll in my dreams, or the knowledge that it's somewhere out there, waiting to return. The night started like any other. I was home alone, sprawled on the couch, scrolling through my phone. The soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the old wooden floors were the only sounds in the apartment. It wasn't until I got up to grab a glass of water that I noticed something odd. As I passed the hallway, I saw it, a shadow. At first, I thought it was just mine, cast by the dim light from the living room, but then I stopped moving. The shadow didn't. It lingered at the end of the hallway, motionless, just slightly darker than the rest of the space. I stared, heart pounding, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe it was a trick of the light, I thought. But deep down, I felt something else, something colder, more primal. "Hello," I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. The shadow didn't respond. It didn't move. I took a hesitant step forward, and as I did, it shifted, just a little, enough to make my stomach drop. It wasn't mine. That much I was certain of now. My legs felt like lead, but I forced myself to take another step, my hands trembling as I reached for the light switch on the wall. The bulb flickered, then came on, flooding the hallway with harsh yellow light. The shadow was gone. The relief that washed over me was short-lived. As I turned to head back to the living room, I saw it again, this time at the corner of my eye, standing at the far end of the room near the window. I spun around, and it vanished once more, leaving only the faint rustle of the curtains swaying as if someone, or something, had just moved past them. By now, my heart was racing. I locked all the windows and doors, double-checking each latch. Whatever it was, I wasn't about to let it inside, or so I thought. That night, I tried to sleep but kept waking up to strange noises. A faint tapping at first, then soft creaks, as if someone was walking down the hall. I stayed under the covers, too afraid to move. Every time I opened my eyes, I thought I saw it, just at the edge of the room, standing still, waiting. By 3 a.m., I couldn't take it anymore. I turned on every light in the apartment and sat in the living room, clutching my phone. But no amount of light made me feel safe. The shadow wasn't deterred. It wasn't bound by darkness. It started showing up in reflections. The TV screen, the glass of water on the table, even in the blank black of my phone screen when it locked. Each time, it got closer. I tried to convince myself I was hallucinating, that I was just exhausted. But the fear was too real, too heavy. At one point, I glanced up and saw it standing directly in front of me, its outline clearer than ever. It was tall, humanoid, but wrong, its form slightly distorted, as if it didn't fully belong in this world. Its head tilted, almost curiously, as if it was studying me. I couldn't scream. I couldn't move. My body felt frozen, pinned under its unseen weight. And then it whispered, soft, barely audible, but unmistakable. "You can't escape me." When I woke up the next morning, I was lying on the floor, the lights still on, the apartment eerily silent. I told myself it was a nightmare, but deep down, I knew better. The shadow wasn't gone. It was just waiting. It still is. It was the dead of winter, and the streets outside my house were silent, blanketed by a thick layer of snow. I was alone that evening, curled up on the couch with a blanket and a cup of tea. The house was quiet, except for the soft crackle of the fireplace and the occasional groan of the old wooden beams in the walls. I had always found the sound comforting, until that night. It started with a knock, 3 sharp taps at the front door, cutting through the stillness of the evening. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. It was late, nearly midnight, and I wasn't expecting anyone. Reluctantly, I got up and peered through the peephole. No one was there. I told myself it was probably just the wind, or maybe the neighbor's kids playing a prank. Still, I couldn't shake the unease settling in the pit of my stomach. I double-checked the locks, drew the curtains, and returned to the couch, trying to convince myself I was being paranoid. Not 5 minutes later, the knocking came again. This time, it was louder. I grabbed my phone, my hand trembling, and made my way back to the door. Once again, I looked through the peephole, and once again, no one was there. But as I started to pull away, I caught something out of the corner of my eye. Movement at the edge of the porch. It was quick, almost too quick to register, but it was enough to make my skin crawl. I stepped back from the door, clutching my phone tightly. I thought about calling the police, but what would I even say? That I heard knocking and saw a shadow? I decided to turn on the porch light, thinking it might scare off whoever, or whatever, was out there. But when I flicked the switch, the bulb didn't come on. It had worked just fine earlier. My unease deepened. Then, the knocking came again, but this time, it wasn't at the door. It was at the window. I spun around, my eyes darting to the living room window. The curtains were drawn, but I could see the faint outline of a figure standing just on the other side. The knock came again, slow and deliberate. I backed away, my breath hitching. "Who's there?" I managed to call out, my voice shaking. No answer. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, its presence heavy and menacing. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I crept closer to the window and yanked the curtain aside. There was no one there. But in the snow just beyond the window, I could see the unmistakable imprint of footprints leading from the front porch to the window, and then disappearing. They didn't trail off into the street or the yard. They just stopped, as if whoever made them had vanished into thin air. I locked every door and window in the house, my heart pounding so loudly it drowned out the eerie silence. I retreated to my bedroom, locking that door too, and sat on the bed with my phone in hand, debating whether to call someone, anyone. That's when I heard it again, knocking. This time, it was coming from inside the house. I stared at the bedroom door, my blood running cold. The sound was faint at first, but grew louder, more insistent. I pressed my ear against the door, my hands shaking uncontrollably, and then I heard it, a low, raspy voice whispering my name. I stumbled back, my mind racing. I knew I hadn't imagined it. Someone, or something, was in the house with me. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the corner of the room, clutching my phone and a heavy flashlight like a lifeline. When morning finally came, I cautiously opened the door. The house was empty, but in the frost on the inside of the living room window, there was a single handprint, small, smudged, and unmistakably human. I moved out of that house the following week. I didn't care about breaking the lease or losing my deposit. Whatever had been there that night wasn't human, and it wasn't going to leave me alone. Even now, in my new apartment miles away, I sometimes hear knocking late at night, and every time I'm too afraid to check. It was a Saturday night, and I was home alone, enjoying the rare quiet of the house. My parents had gone out for the evening, leaving me with the responsibility of looking after our place. The house was old, creaky, and full of character, but I'd never been afraid of it. Until that night. I had settled into the living room with a bowl of popcorn, binge-watching my favorite show, when I heard it. At first, it was faint, a soft shuffling sound coming from upstairs. I paused the show and listened. The house was supposed to be empty, and my parents wouldn't be back for hours. Probably just the wind, I muttered to myself, trying to ignore the knot of anxiety tightening in my chest. But the noise didn't stop. The shuffling turned into what sounded like footsteps, slow, deliberate, and heavy. They moved across the ceiling, as though someone was pacing back and forth in my parents' bedroom. I grabbed my phone and stood frozen in the living room, staring up at the ceiling. Every logical part of me said it couldn't be anything serious. Maybe a squirrel had gotten into the attic. Maybe the old house was settling. But deep down, I knew better. Summoning my courage, I crept up the stairs. Each step felt like a lifetime, the wood groaning beneath my weight. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from a small lamp at the far end. My parents' bedroom door was ajar, the faintest sliver of light spilling out into the hall. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. No answer. I pushed the door open slowly, my heart pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears. The room was empty. Everything was exactly as it should be. The bed neatly made, the curtains drawn. There was no sign of anyone or anything. I let out a shaky breath, laughing nervously at myself for being so paranoid. But as I turned to leave, I caught sight of something that made my stomach drop. A footprint, clear as day, in the thick layer of dust on the floor near the closet. It was large, far too large to be mine or my parents'. My blood ran cold as I stared at the closet door. It was slightly ajar, a crack of darkness visible between the frame and the door. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then, slowly, the door creaked open just a little more. I bolted out of the room, tripping over my own feet as I scrambled down the stairs. I grabbed the house phone and dialed 911, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped the receiver. "There's someone in my house," I told the operator, my voice trembling. "Please, send someone quickly." The operator assured me help was on the way, but those few minutes felt like hours. I stayed in the living room, clutching a kitchen knife I'd grabbed in a panic, and stared at the staircase, waiting for the intruder to come down. But no one did. When the police arrived, they searched the entire house. They found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no evidence of anyone else being there. The footprint in the dust had somehow vanished, and the officers suggested I might have imagined it. But I know what I saw. I haven't been able to sleep upstairs since that night. I stay on the couch in the living room, too afraid to go back to my room. Every now and then, I still hear those footsteps overhead, slow and deliberate, as if whoever, or whatever, it was never really left. The night was unusually quiet, the kind of silence that feels heavy, like the world is holding its breath. I was sitting in my room, finishing up some homework, when I noticed the motion-activated porch light flick on outside. It wasn't unusual for a stray cat or a gust of wind to trigger it, but something about the way the light stayed on made me uneasy. I stood up and peeked through the blinds. At first, I didn't see anything, just the empty driveway and the faint glow of the streetlights. But then I noticed it, a figure standing at the edge of the yard, just beyond the circle of light. The person wasn't moving, just standing there, watching the house. I couldn't make out any features in the darkness, but I could tell they were tall, with broad shoulders. My heart began to race. I thought about calling my parents, but they were out at a dinner party and wouldn't be home for hours. I didn't want to seem paranoid, so I told myself it was probably a neighbor or someone walking their dog. But the figure didn't move. They just stood there, like they were waiting. I tried to shake off the fear and went back to my desk, but I couldn't focus. Every few minutes, I found myself glancing at the window, hoping the figure would be gone. It wasn't. The light flicked off, plunging the yard into darkness. I exhaled in relief, thinking they had left. But when the light came back on a few moments later, the figure was closer, standing halfway up the driveway now. I froze. My chest tightened as I realized this wasn't just a coincidence. Whoever it was, they were approaching the house. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my hands shaking. The operator's calm voice did little to soothe me as I explained the situation. They assured me an officer would be dispatched immediately. I hung up and sat on the edge of my bed, my ears straining for any sound. The light outside flicked off again, and then I heard it. A faint tapping at the front door. It was slow and deliberate, like whoever was on the other side wanted me to know they were there. I crept down the hallway, keeping my footsteps as quiet as possible. When I reached the front door, I hesitated. The peephole was right there, but part of me didn't want to look. Finally, I gathered the courage and pressed my eye to the tiny glass window. The porch was empty. No one was there. I backed away from the door, my pulse hammering in my ears. The tapping came again, louder this time, but not from the front door. It was coming from the back of the house. I spun around, my stomach dropping. The back door had a glass pane, and as I approached, I saw a handprint smeared on the outside, trailing down the glass like someone had pressed their palm there and dragged it down. I couldn't breathe. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the coffee table. The police arrived a few minutes later, their flashing lights cutting through the darkness. 2 officers searched the property, while another stayed with me in the living room, asking questions I could barely answer. They didn't find anyone, but as they were leaving, one of the officers stopped and pointed something out to his partner. A series of footprints in the snow led from the driveway to the back door, but they didn't lead away. There were no tracks leaving the yard. To this day, I don't know where that person went or how they disappeared, but sometimes, late at night, I still hear that faint tapping sound, like they're letting me know they're still out there, watching. It was one of those rare nights when everything felt off. I had been staying at my aunt's house for a weekend, a large old farmhouse tucked away on the outskirts of town. The house was beautiful, but creaked and groaned in a way that made the silence feel heavier, more oppressive. The kind of silence that makes you question if you're truly alone. I'd settled in for the night, the warm glow of the fireplace casting flickering shadows across the room. My aunt had retired early, and I was left with the entire house to myself. At first it felt peaceful, a much-needed escape from the hustle and bustle of my regular life. But, as the night wore on, I couldn't shake the growing sense that something was wrong. It started with the noise, a soft rhythmic thudding, coming from somewhere upstairs. I tried to dismiss it as the house settling, but the sound persisted, steady and unnerving, like footsteps. I told myself it was just my imagination, maybe an animal in the attic, or the wind rattling the old windows, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was up there. Curiosity got the best of me, and I decided to investigate. I grabbed a flashlight and slowly made my way up the narrow staircase, the wooden steps creaking beneath my weight. As I reached the top, I stood in the hallway, my heart thudding in my chest. The house was silent again. I walked cautiously down the hallway, towards the guest room where I was staying. The thudding had stopped, but a new sound had replaced it. Whispering, soft, unintelligible whispers that seemed to come from the room at the end of the hall. I wasn't sure if I was hearing things, but something about the whispers felt too real, too close. I stood there for a moment, frozen in place. Then, without thinking, I moved toward the source of the sound. The closer I got, the more distinct the voices became, like muffled murmurs, as if people were talking behind a closed door. I reached the door to the room, but it was locked. A cold shiver ran down my spine. The whispers stopped abruptly, and in the sudden silence, I heard something else. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming toward me from the other side of the door. I stepped back, my breath catching in my throat. I turned to run, but before I could take more than 2 steps, the door creaked open. My heart pounded in my ears as I faced an empty, dark room. But something didn't feel right. There was a presence in the room, something I couldn't see but could feel. It was as if the air itself had thickened with something dark and oppressive. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang. I spun around, heart racing, but there was no one there. The room remained empty, but the whispers started again, louder this time, more frantic. I bolted out of the room and ran back down the hallway, my mind reeling, but when I reached the stairs, I froze. There, at the bottom of the staircase, standing just out of the reach of the light, was a figure. It was tall and thin, its face obscured by shadows. It didn't move, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The figure took a step forward, and that's when I noticed it. The faint sound of a child's laughter, echoing from somewhere deep inside the house. It was eerie, hollow, like a memory too old to remember. I turned and ran down the stairs, bursting through the front door and out into the cold night air. I didn't stop running until I reached my aunt's house next door. I knocked frantically, shaking, but when my aunt answered, she didn't seem surprised. "You saw it, didn't you?" she asked, her voice low, almost sorrowful. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I just nodded, my chest tight with fear. She led me inside, and as I glanced back at the farmhouse, I saw it again. Through the window, a shadowy figure standing in the doorway, staring out at me. My aunt sat me down and explained in quiet tones that the house had always been like that. Strange things happened there, things that couldn't be explained. And as for the figure, it was a part of the house, a presence that had been there long before they moved in. It was the spirit of a child, lost and forgotten, still haunting the halls. I never spent another night in that house. I don't know if it was the spirit of a child, or something far darker. But one thing was clear. There was something in that house that would never let go, something that would always be waiting, watching, until someone else crossed its path. I had just moved into a new apartment, a small, cozy unit on the 3rd floor of an old building in the middle of the city. The rent was cheap, and the place was perfect for someone like me, quiet, private, and in a relatively safe neighborhood. It wasn't the kind of place that would attract attention, which is exactly what I wanted after moving away from a more hectic environment. The first few days were uneventful. I spent my time unpacking, setting up the furniture, and getting used to the sounds of the building. The walls creaked when the wind blew, and the pipes often rattled late at night, but nothing that set off any alarms. It felt like a peaceful place to call home. But then, late on the 4th night, I heard something. At first it was just a soft thud, a faint noise like something had fallen over. I brushed it off, thinking it was just the old building settling, or maybe my neighbor moving around. But then, it came again. A loud, distinct bang, like something heavy being dropped. I froze, my blood running cold. I lived alone. There was no one else in the apartment. I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting, but I couldn't shake the unease. The noise was coming from the apartment next door, which was supposed to be empty. The landlord had told me that no one had lived there for months. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to check. I crept out of my apartment and knocked on the door to the empty unit. No one answered. I knocked again, harder this time, and still, there was no response. The door was locked, and there was no sign of anyone inside. Feeling a little ridiculous, I returned to my apartment. The noise had stopped, and I was left to second-guess myself. Maybe it had been the pipes after all. That night, I tried to sleep, but the sense of unease wouldn't leave me. The quiet of the apartment felt suffocating, and every little creak or rustle made my heart race. Just as I was drifting off, I heard it again. The same loud bang, followed by something else. Soft footsteps. I bolted upright in bed, my pulse pounding in my ears. I could hear the footsteps getting closer, slow and deliberate. They sounded like they were coming from inside my own apartment, but no one was there. I grabbed my phone and started to dial the landlord, but before I could press call, the door to my bedroom creaked open. A cold gust of air swept through the room, and the temperature seemed to drop. The footsteps had stopped. I was paralyzed, unable to move, unable to scream. Standing in the doorway was a figure, a dark shape, hunched over, barely visible in the dim light. I could barely make out the features, but the presence felt wrong, like something that didn't belong in the world of the living. It took a slow step forward, its head tilting at an unnatural angle, its eyes fixed on me. I don't know how long we stood there, locked in that awful, silent stare. My breath caught in my throat, and I could feel my heart racing faster and faster. But then, as if on cue, the figure stepped back and vanished into the shadows. I stumbled out of bed, my hands shaking violently, as I rushed to turn on every light in the apartment. I searched every corner, every closet, but the figure was gone. The apartment felt empty again, too quiet. I couldn't tell if I had imagined it, or if something truly was in the apartment with me. But when I checked the hallway, I saw something that made my stomach drop. The door to the empty apartment next door was wide open, and the faint outline of someone, or something, was standing in the doorway. I could just make out the figure, hunched and still, just like before. I ran back to my apartment, locked the door, and didn't leave for the rest of the night. When morning came, I packed up my things and moved out, leaving the building and its eerie silence behind. To this day, I don't know what I saw that night or what I heard, but I do know this. The building is still there, standing on the corner of the street, and sometimes, when I pass by, I can see a shadow standing in the window of the empty apartment on the third floor, watching. It was the dead of winter, and I was staying at my grandparents' house for the weekend. The old farmhouse, nestled in a remote part of the countryside, had always felt a bit off. But I loved the place, the creaky floors, the smell of wood smoke, the quiet solitude. It was a perfect escape from the hustle and bustle of city life. That night, after a hearty dinner and a few rounds of cards with my grandparents, they decided to retire to their room early, leaving me alone by the fireplace. The storm outside had grown fierce, the wind howling against the windows and the snow piling up in thick drifts against the door. The power had flickered a few times, but it had held. I curled up in an armchair with a blanket, reading a book to pass the time. The fire crackled in the hearth, and the house settled around me, making those strange, low, groaning noises it always made. But tonight, there was something different, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I brushed it off, blaming the storm, and kept reading. Then, I heard it, a soft knock. At first I thought it was the wind, but the knocking came again, louder this time and more deliberate. It sounded like it was coming from the kitchen, just beyond the living room. I stood up, the blanket slipping from my shoulders, and walked cautiously toward the kitchen. The door to the back of the house was ajar, a sliver of darkness beyond. "Grandpa?" I called out, my voice a little shaky. I didn't expect an answer, but I felt the need to check. The silence that followed made my skin crawl. I stepped closer to the door and pushed it open, half expecting my grandparents to be standing there, ready to play a prank on me. But there was no one. I walked into the kitchen, the floorboards creaking beneath my feet. The light over the stove flickered. I turned it on, and the warmth from the bulb was a relief against the bitter cold of the storm outside. That's when I noticed the strange markings on the floor. The kitchen floor was made of old wooden planks, and on them, in the dust and grime that had collected over the years, were scratches, long, deep grooves, like something had been dragged across the floor. They were fresh. I knelt down, my heart hammering in my chest. Something had definitely moved through here, and it hadn't been a human. Suddenly, the air grew colder. A gust of wind howled through the cracks in the walls, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. That's when I heard it again, closer this time. A low, guttural growl coming from the other side of the kitchen. I turned, my breath catching in my throat. There, standing in the dark corner of the room, was a figure. Its eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, reflecting an unnatural green. It was hunched over, its body covered in matted fur, and its face, though shadowed, seemed to be smiling. A grin that didn't belong. The growl intensified, and I froze. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I could feel its gaze on me, locking me in place. It took a step forward, and I finally snapped out of my trance. I bolted out of the kitchen, nearly tripping over my own feet, and raced up the stairs to my grandparents' room. I pounded on their door, shouting their names, but they didn't answer. The knocking continued, now coming from the walls, the floor, everywhere. It was like the house itself was alive, and whatever was inside, it wanted to make sure I knew it. I ran to the back door, but when I opened it, the snowstorm outside had grown so intense I could barely see a few feet in front of me. My only option was to head upstairs, to my grandparents' room. I didn't stop running until I was standing in front of their door, but when I tried to open it, it wouldn't budge. I could hear them inside, muffled voices, whispering, but it wasn't my grandparents' voices. I pounded on the door, my heart racing. "Grandma! Grandpa!" Finally, the door creaked open, but when I stepped inside, the room was empty. There was no sign of them, just the same strange markings on the floor, now leading from the bed to the window. I couldn't breathe. In the mirror above the dresser, something moved behind me, a shadow. Slowly, I turned around. There it was again. The creature, now standing in the doorway, its mouth wide open, a grin stretched unnaturally wide across its face. I couldn't scream. I couldn't run. All I could do was stand there, paralyzed in fear, as it took a step toward me. Then, just as quickly as it appeared, it vanished. The room was silent again, the mirror reflecting nothing but my own horrified face. I've never seen my grandparents again. The next morning their room was empty, and the house was abandoned. The storm had passed, and the sun was shining, but the strange feeling never left. To this day, I don't know if they were taken by whatever it was in the house, or if they simply vanished on their own. But I never set foot in that farmhouse again. And sometimes, when the wind picks up late at night, it was a quiet Friday night, and I was home alone, just like any other evening. The house felt peaceful, almost too peaceful. I had spent the week working overtime at my job and was looking forward to a weekend of rest. The rain pattered against the windows, and the occasional flash of lightning lit up the dark sky outside. The perfect atmosphere for unwinding. I settled into the living room with a book and a cup of tea, the soft hum of the refrigerator the only noise. As the night wore on, I felt myself growing drowsy. I set the book aside, turned off the lights, and curled up on the couch, ready to drift off to sleep. That's when I heard it. A soft tap, tap, tap coming from the window. I tried to ignore it. It was probably just the wind causing the branches outside to brush against the glass. But the tapping grew louder, more deliberate. It wasn't the wind. Someone, or something, was outside, knocking on my window. I hesitated for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't want to go near the window, but my curiosity got the better of me. I stood up, my footsteps heavy in the silence, and moved toward the window. When I looked outside, I saw nothing. The yard was empty, and the rain fell in sheets, blurring my view. I was about to pull away when I noticed something strange. A figure, pale, thin, and hunched over, was standing at the edge of my yard. It was facing me, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, as though it was studying me. I froze, unable to look away. The tapping started again, but this time it wasn't on the window. It was coming from the door, the front door. My breath caught in my throat as I backed away from the window, panic rising in my chest. Whoever, or whatever, was out there had moved. I didn't know what to do. Should I call the police? Should I stay hidden? I grabbed my phone, fingers trembling as I dialed 911. But before the call could connect, I heard it again, a sharp, rattling noise followed by a voice that wasn't mine. "Let me in," it whispered. "I'm so cold." I dropped my phone, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice sounded so real, so close, but I hadn't heard anyone come to the door. There was no way it could have been a prank or a recording. The door rattled again, louder this time, as though someone was trying to force their way in. I rushed to the door and peered through the peephole. I saw nothing. I opened the door slightly, my hand trembling on the knob. The porch light flickered, casting an eerie glow on the empty steps, and then I saw it. The figure from the yard, standing right in front of me, its face pale and twisted with an unsettling smile. It had eyes, dark, empty eyes that seemed to stare right through me. Its hands were outstretched, its fingers long and skeletal. Before I could react, the figure lunged forward, its cold hands grabbing my arm. I screamed, struggling to free myself, but the grip was too tight, its skin icy against mine. Just as suddenly as it appeared, the figure let go and vanished into the night, leaving me standing in the doorway, breathless and shaken. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my heart racing in my chest. The house was silent again. I spent the rest of the night awake, too terrified to sleep. The figure didn't return, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, watching. Every creak in the house, every gust of wind, sent my heart into overdrive. The next morning I checked the porch. There were no signs of anyone having been there, no tracks in the wet grass. It was as though the entire thing had been a nightmare. But when I looked closely at the doorframe, I noticed something that made my stomach churn. There, in the wood, were faint scratch marks, deep grooves, like something had tried to claw its way in.